Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to see so many of you here. This is a day where we want to talk about partnerships, about ecosystem, how we can deliver for people on the ground with all the big challenges that we heard and talked about yesterday. So I want to move right on to introducing our really stellar panel. Thank you so much, Andrea. So I want to welcome Margaret Atieno-Mbeza, who's the Commissioner for Climate Change in the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda, and the UNFCCC focal point for Uganda. A warm welcome to you. Please come up on stage. We have Stephanie Teatro from Unbound Philanthropy in the US, who's their director for the US programs. Welcome. We have Sanjula Varasinghe, the Global Coordinator for Migration and Displacement at the International Federation of the Red Crescent Movements. Welcome. We have one of our inaugural Climate Mobility Fellows of the GCCM, Chiamaka Rita Agpogu. Welcome. And last but not least, Giovanni Pagani from C40 Cities. Welcome. So dear guests, we will also open up to listen from you, your ideas, your comments, your thoughts, your questions to the panel, and we'll start with a panel conversation with everybody, and then open up to you. We also will have stellar closing keynote remarks from our wonderful colleague Phyllis Beekman at the end of the session. I want to start with you, Vera, and really, Sanjula, I'm very sorry to hear from the work that you're doing globally. How does climate mobility center in your work, especially in displacement context that you're working?
Thanks, Rafaela, and hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I think you would have heard that I'm from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and I'm hoping that many of you know who we are. But for anyone who doesn't, we have 191 national societies around the world, so almost in every country. And what that means is that it gives us a privilege of being the world's largest humanitarian network. It also means that we have almost 200,000 local branches that are located in each of those countries. So in the places where climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters happen. And in terms of our work, the backbone of it is done by 16 million volunteers. People who are from the communities, people who are affected by climate change, people who are affected by disasters and responding to them. And yesterday at the reception, thinking about our vantage point and how we approach this issue, yesterday at the reception I asked a few colleagues, quizzed them in fact, and said, what do you know about what national societies do in this space, how we address climate mobility? And I think a lot of people know that we are often the first responder. We're there when disasters strike to provide assistance, protection, essential services, relief. And that's absolutely right. That's certainly what we do. But in this space, on this issue, we do a lot more. We work across the climate mobility continuum. National societies, through their volunteers, through their local branches, help to identify and reduce risks before disasters strike, before displacement happens. They help prepare communities. They help develop early warning systems so that impacts can be reduced, so that loss and damage can be reduced. And then They provide relief and support, as you know, and they also work on supporting resilient recovery. So we work across that cycle, and that's one vantage point through which we approach this issue. And all of that work, I hope when you hear that work, that resonates with the conversation we had yesterday. Because all of that work is ultimately about emphasising choice and agency. It's about community and local leadership, and sustainable community and local leadership. And it's about drawing on the local context, the local experiences, and the local knowledge that is at hand to define and drive the longer-term response. And ultimately, what that's trying to do is create two broad parallel options. And again, I hope this also resonates with what we heard yesterday, which is about promoting the ability for people to stay and adapt in their homes, in their communities, in their countries, if that is their preference. And we heard that that is the preference for many people. And it is also about creating sustainable options for people to move with safety and dignity out of harm's way. So maybe that's enough for now.
I want to stay with you for a bit, and also ask you, because we are talking about climate mobility, ecosystem, partnerships. What do you need, and which partners do you need to do your work better, to be more impactful, to serve the communities better, and in the long term? Are there ingredients where you say, if we get this right, we can even improve our work serving those most affected?
Yeah, great, thanks, Rafaela. Yes, and so one vantage point I wanted to highlight was our local national societies. There's one thing I didn't mention, and I'll get to your question. The other part of this humanitarian network is the IFASI Secretariat. So that's where I'm from. And as a secretariat, I'm based in Geneva, but there are also offices in 5 regions, as well as representative offices in Brussels, New York, and Addis. And so what the secretariat does is help to elevate local realities into global spaces, such as this one, and into regional spaces, and to bring those into informed conversations that we're having in spaces that drive different frameworks and tools and funding mechanisms, so that we are working from the ground up while we're working from the top down as well. Thinking about the ecosystem and what we actually need, I think there are 2 kind of key points first that I want to make about who needs to be part of that ecosystem. And hark back to this key objective, I think, that we're all trying to achieve, which is about people being able to stay and people being able to move in safety and dignity. That's not an easy objective. It's a complex objective. We've all understood it yesterday. It requires a whole host of different actors, a whole host of different frameworks, a whole host of different tools and approaches. But I want to make sure that we don't forget 2 key actors who always need to be part of that ecosystem, and that's affected communities. And affected communities are not monolithic, they're not homogenous, they're not one group. There are so many different types of people who fall into those affected communities. They are the people who are repeatedly displaced. They are the people who are migrating because they have to, but are invisible because they're moving into urban areas, into locations that are hazard prone, and no one sees them because they're under the radar. They're the IDPs and refugees living in camps in hazard-exposed areas who don't receive early warning, who don't receive disaster risk reduction. They're the host communities, the families, the relatives who keep these people in their homes and support them. But as a consequence, their resilience is also reduced when the next flood hits. So as we think about our ecosystem, I don't think any one of us can work without thinking deeply and concretely about the communities we're talking about and understanding them from each specific context and recognising there are different groups of people we need to consider.
Thank you. And that was also the example that we heard from the Maldives, and thinking about the communities that are needed to be on board for disaster response and getting that right and preparing the ground for that kind of work. Commissioner, it's great to have you here from Uganda. I'd be curious to understand how Uganda is responding, and what role partnerships play for your climate mobility work at this point.
Thank you so much, Raphael, and also to our dear esteemed guests, Your Excellencies, and in particular the organizers of this very important dialogue. As you rightly said, what is Uganda doing? I want to share a bit of our experience. Uganda is one of the forerunners in the issues to do with climate change, climate mobility, and displacement. In Uganda, we have an open door policy when it comes to refugees, migration, because we feel people don't move because they want to move in most cases. And in Uganda, climate change is really hitting us. As you all know, most of all our least developed countries, we are really suffering from the impacts of climate change. Not because we want it, but it is here with us. So we need to embrace it. Uganda has embraced climate mobility, and our president in 2022 launched the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment, and Climate Change. That shows you that Uganda is really in the forefront to fight the impacts of climate change and migration when it comes to that. So we have that open door policy, and now it is time for us to ensure that this Kampala Declaration is implemented. It has very good strategies in there, but we need to ensure we get partners to implement them. But I also want to thank so much the Global Center for Climate Mobility. We are doing so much with this center. We've started this partnership. We went into a deep dive to really study what is causing all this climate mobility, and we have now the national blueprint on climate mobility for Uganda. We launched this, and it is time again for us to ensure that we implement it. With the support from, again, Global Center for Climate Mobility, we are now supporting districts. In our National Climate Change Act, we are mandated as lead agencies, and lead agencies include cities, includes ministries, departments, agencies, to prepare what we call our district or lead agency action plans. What are those climate change action plans? And I really want to thank the center, because the center is now supporting a number of districts in the country to develop what we call district climate change action plans. And based on that, again, our National Climate Change Act provides for that the minister responsible for finance should provide resources, finances to implement these action plans. So that is a big stepping stone for us as the Minister of Water and Environment that is coordinating and leading climate actions in the country. With cities, Uganda has so many cities. We have cities, 11 so far, but they are growing, which means we are also supposed to have each of our cities prepare cities climate change action plans, and government should provide resources for that. I really want to thank the center, and we are calling upon partners to support even the other lead agencies, because so far we are not doing so well when it comes to that. Then another thing is Uganda is such a young population. 70% of our population is very young. So a lot of movement from the rural areas to urban centers. 5% of our population is in the cities, or even more. That is over 10 million people in urban areas. So what are we doing with this young population that is very vibrant? We need to ensure that they are involved in climate actions. So those are areas where we really need support to ensure we create green jobs across the board, across all sectors. And it is possible to do it across sectors. With climate change, we cannot work in silos. It is time for us to work in a very integrated landscape. And that is why that ecosystem for climate mobility is very critical. We need the landscape approach to sorting any climate change issue. If you work with one entity, you will be creating problems somewhere else. I can give you an example. Uganda is very rich when it comes to the natural capital wealth. Wetlands, forests, mountains, waters, very wealthy. However, we can have, for example, our ministry responsible for the infrastructure, roads, creating a road somewhere, constructing a road over a wetland, and we are getting flooding in some parts, in many parts of the country, because we are working in silos. So we really need partnerships to ensure we are planning together and implementing these actions together. Yeah, I think for that, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm hearing also this cross-ministerial work and the partnerships in the country, and then the international partnerships like you have with the Global Center. And one thing really stuck with me is going down to the district level and doing the work with the very, very local communities on what it means. That's very impressive. Thank you so much. And you made the perfect segue to Giovanni from C40 cities, and you work with mayors, with cities on climate action, but also on climate mobility, on climate migration. And I mean, coalition building is at the core of what you do when it comes to cities, but it would be great to understand a little bit on this particular issues, how you are advancing this work and what coalition building means for you at this moment in time.
Thank you, Rafaela, and good morning again, everyone. Just maybe as a way of introduction for those of you who might not be aware of C40 Cities as a network, briefly, is a global network of nearly 100 mayors committed to accelerate climate action in a just and equitable way.
Giovanni, can you put the mic a little bit closer?
Yeah, better, sorry. And a few years ago, in partnership with another network, the Mayors Migration Council, upon a demand really coming from our cities across regions, we started working on the nexus between how cities were experiencing climate change and mobility. And we did so, as done in the past by our network, really building on political leadership of mayors. So we built a task force of nearly 10 mayors across regions committed to raising the issue on global agendas. And it's great to see that forums like this are happening, bringing together this ecosystem and allowing for local voices and cities to be part of the conversation, and to accelerate global responses through mayoral leadership, city-led action, and local data. And we've really seen that over a few years, thanks to multi-stakeholder collaboration, including partners like Robert Bosch Foundation, in collaboration sometimes with national governments, but really in consultation and involving local affected communities and migrants displaced by climate impacts. We have seen kind of a growing recognition also across cities, across the network, of this being a frontier issue for them to act, both on a climate justice perspective and a social justice perspective. And we have focused kind of on an action agenda that identifies kind of 3 broad areas of priorities, really in line also with the key messages and focus of this conference. Solutions that cities can implement, allowing people to stay, but also build resilience locally in the context both of fast-paced urbanization, moving people into cities, but also preventing displacement from happening within urban settings. Inclusion, so what cities can do in terms of facilitating access to essential services for people on the move, including those displaced by climate impacts, and transformation relates more kind of to how that connects to the whole conversation on green transition and green jobs. So I think with an important link also on narrative shift. So how can we reflect on not just climate change as a driver of mobility, but also as the role that migration, labor mobility, and migrants and refugees can play in the context of a green transition. And I'm happy that the Commissioner mentioned earlier green jobs as an opportunity also to invest in communities of origin, providing people an alternative to stay, but also how migration can be leveraged as a positive contribution in societies of arrival in context of green transition and green jobs creation. And the advantage that we have been seeing working with cities, we mentioned yesterday kind of the ability to break silos and work on policy integration. I think cities kind of have done a lot of work in terms of kind of bringing together different departments and kind of breaking those silos. And glad to hear examples yesterday from ministries on kind of how that's happening also at the national level, but also kind of with a smaller scale of operations, allowing kind of to test solutions that can serve as a proof of concept. And we have a few examples on that in terms of how cities have been able to kind of contribute to a shared repository of practices that come into the ecosystem, allow for a common language, and how kind of what common solutions can be implemented when it comes to climate mobility at the local level, and also kind of really facilitating then elevation in the national context as well as kind of replication in similar contexts elsewhere.
And I mean, when we talk about, and there are so many examples of cities leading in Uganda, all over the world on this issue, I want to ask you about financing, because that is, I mean, a key demand, I know, of C40 when it comes to localized financing. How do cities handle the immense task that they want to and need to approach when it comes to climate mobility, and what would you think are the mechanisms needed and the partnership needed also when it comes to financing, or especially on a city level?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, you're right, that's probably one of the main barriers that local actors are facing in this respect, in spite kind of major commitments in terms of localization. There is kind of a lot of room for improvement, both when we discuss the climate financing landscape in the humanitarian funding system and in the more development funding ecosystem. I think in that respect, connecting to what was the point I was mentioning earlier in terms of making the case, I think that philanthropic donors have been kind of really helpful in making the case and kind of investing in innovative solutions that can work and kind of showing how practical solutions look in practice, to then make the case for scaling up and allowing cities to access either follow-on funding or replicability. So I think that's certainly an essential aspect. We have kind of great examples, for instance, from both C40's Inclusive Climate Action Fund and Mayor's Migration Council Global Cities Fund on how that has been working in places like Accra, for instance, in Ghana, with a main focus on the recognition of informal workers in the waste management sector, and how that recognition backed by political leadership at the local level and strong integration with local climate action plans and social policies really allowed to make the case for impacts that kind of went beyond the project itself at the national level. And in terms of kind of financing, I think, well, in terms of opportunities, for instance, I think for the ecosystem is very important that a mechanism like the newly operationalized Loss and Damage Fund provides, on the one hand, a strong recognition of climate mobility as an issue to be supported from the climate perspective. And in terms of priorities, we really kind of look forward to engaging in that space in terms of making sure that not only there is kind of a positive integration from a financing perspective in terms of how human mobility and climate-related mobility can be supported from a climate perspective, but also elements like direct access for local communities and cities, or kind of elements of consultation with local actors can really be incorporated and provide a precedent for then scaling up.
No, thanks so much, and there will be so many fantastic examples that we could dive into, but I want to move on to you, Chiamaka. You're part of the inaugural cohort of the Climate Mobility Fellows. It's fantastic to have you part of that, but you're also an academic and a researcher. And I first want to ask you, what brought you to this issue and this work? And then we're going to move on into where it's heading.
Thank you very much for this question, Rafaela. So what brought me to climate mobility? I think it started with my growing up in Lagos, a coastal city, and having to live with flooding, witnessing the devastating impacts of flooding. And I took this with me into my professional journey, where I was supporting the reintegration of returned migrants. In this sense, those that are forced to return back to Nigeria from host countries, and even those coerced to return via assisted voluntary return schemes. And we had to try to reintegrate them across the economic areas, social areas, and psychosocial areas because they come back traumatized and they need support to rebuild their lives. But somehow I found that the same climate vulnerabilities affected their attempts to rebuild their lives. And so poultry farming or agricultural endeavors are thwarted by droughts, by flooding, that disrupts livelihoods. And so it made it really pressing for me. It made it very personal to me. And I took this with me when I commenced my master's studies, and now that I am focusing on research. So this is a plight that is part of my story, my journey, and with my experiences, my resolve to contribute to making things better sharpens. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, and with this experience, your personal experience and the academic work that you're doing, when it comes to building coalitions and partnerships who help those communities. What do you think is missing? What do you hope for also in this work?
That's a good question. Thank you. Because in the academia, it's more about knowledge production. That's the focus most times. I think coalitions would mean, first of all, centering those most affected by climate mobility, climate vulnerability. So working closely with them to co-produce knowledge. I think the terms on which knowledge are at times gotten for research endeavors can be defined as extractive. And so we can perhaps form more coalitions or allow for co-production of knowledge with the most vulnerable. And then I think it would require going a step further to disseminate knowledge gained or knowledge produced. And that would mean probably partnering with the media to disseminate knowledge produced that centers the lived experiences of those most affected, to increase their knowledge of their plight, urgency of action, but then also to throw light on the intersectional challenges, because when people talk about reintegration, for example, they talk about, people come back and they're traumatized, but people do not realize that they have to deal with a double trauma, the double vulnerability of coming back, trying to rebuild your life, and also being, impaired by climate vulnerability. So this is something that the academia, rethinking the terms of coalition, can help to contribute to. But then also, back on co-producing knowledge, it would help in helping in gaining knowledge of indigenous knowledge systems, which have been jettisoned along the way. So I think it's important to rethink the terms in which the academia, the researchers produce knowledge, to regard it as an iterative process and be intentional about other stakeholders to partner with, to ensure that knowledge is gotten, that the plight of the most affected are centered, but then that they are not framed as passive recipients of aid, as just vulnerable people, but they are reframed as co-creators or co-designers of interventions, people with agency. It's important to change that perspective, change that narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's really powerful, and this is something very concretely that can be done also maybe out of your fellowship and the time that you spend with the center. Stephanie, you're at Unbound Philanthropy. You're leading work in the U.S. I think it's on. You're leading work in the U.S. and we haven't heard much these days from the United States. Which is significantly affected also by sea level rise, by climate mobility. So tell us a little bit what your work looks like, what the situation looks like, and how you're working in coalition in these contexts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I've learned so much from all of the speakers yesterday and this morning. So I'm here representing Unbound Philanthropy in the sort of US philanthropic sector, but I'm newer to philanthropy. I'm an organizer by training. I come from the labor movement and the immigrant justice movement in the US, and before joining Unbound Philanthropy last year, I was an organizer in the climate migration ecosystem in the US. And it's complex, of course, in the US. I think my work in the immigrant justice movement has always been the sort of corner of the ecosystem that is about making the US more welcoming to immigrants and having a more just and robust and equitable immigration system and communities that are ready to welcome. Of course, we are also a country that is disproportionately responsible for the climate crisis, and there is a part of the ecosystem that for years has been putting pressure on our government to help create the Loss and Damage Fund and to fund it adequately. But we are also a country that is experiencing extraordinary climate impacts, and each year millions of Americans themselves are on the move, displaced from due to climate change. And so the ecosystem of climate mobility in the US is working on all of those elements, right? When it comes to sort of the right to stay, you have groups who are working on resilience and adaptation in coastal Louisiana and along all of the coast of the US, as well as organizations who are, again, trying to get the US to fund loss and damage and other climate finance. We have people who are working on the right to move, not only sort of managed retreat and planned relocation in the US, but also, again, kind of generous migration pathways, and preparing our communities to welcome newcomers, whether they're coming from Miami or they're coming from Central America. But in general, I would say the ecosystem itself, while it's rich and there are leaders doing extraordinary work, it's still quite nascent in the way that we look at an ecosystem as far as organizations working together in an aligned way with a coordinated strategy. That is still kind of emergent in the US. And so we have brilliant organizers who are building power, including with diaspora communities, brilliant think tanks, architecting sort of new policy and legal frameworks, resilience specialists, local government leaders, certainly philanthropy, but it's all quite siloed. And so our role at Unbound Philanthropy, while we're a small foundation, we try to fund across that whole ecosystem and help to sort of convene and connect all of those different strategies. And for us, the sort of two divides within the ecosystem that we're really focused on. One is sort of bridging the divide between the traditional climate justice movement and the immigrant justice movement, both amongst sort of organizations as well as philanthropy. And then secondly, between internally displaced communities within the US and the millions of Americans who now have the experience of having to move because of climate change, with those who are coming from farther abroad and helping to build relationships of solidarity and a sort of vision of just climate mobility.
Thank you. And I want to prompt one question to you that is about our sector, philanthropy, and provoking a little bit on, specifically on the issue of climate mobility. How well do you think we are already in working in coalitions, in supporting this important work, and what will be things that you can also, from your ecosystem building work that you're doing in the US, you think philanthropies can do better as we move forward in supporting also such an agenda?
Yeah, so again, before sort of starting this role at a US foundation, I was working in the climate mobility ecosystem and trying to raise money for that organizing work. And it's no secret to everybody in this room that there's just not a lot of foundations who see climate mobility as their sort of issue area, right? We have migration funders who say, yes, we fund migration, but not climate, or climate funders who fund adaptation, but not migration. And so I think our sector, I think, has a lot of work to do to ourselves, sort of de-silo, but the work itself is not that different than sort of the movements that I was a part of, where we were trying to sort of bridge climate and migration. I think a lot of it requires sort of time and relationship building. I think that the climate sector and the migration sector speak very different languages and have very different sort of North Star kind of orientations. I know for myself, as a migrant justice advocate, as well as many people from the migration philanthropy, it's always about movement, right? And the right to safely move and the right to be welcomed. And I've learned immensely, especially through spaces at GCCM, how paramount the right to stay is. And so I think that what we've been working on specifically with adaptation funders is we found that kind of spectrum of climate mobility as a really helpful kind of entry point for people to see sort of the protecting the right to stay, safe mobility pathways, as well as people being welcomed wherever they land, as sort of an entry point, and that people are coming into the ecosystem from many, funders are coming into that ecosystem from many different points, whether it's workforce development, whether it's the just transition, whether it's safe migration pathways, and how we can see ourselves as sort of part of that coherent ecosystem as well. And so, of course, this field is incredibly under-resourced, and I think that the Bosch Foundation, Unbound, many of us are trying to do our part to raise more resources for this sort of critical work. But I think that there is a lot of openings, especially within climate philanthropy, where adaptation, the need for successful adaptation has become so clear, and it's sort of our job to really help locate mobility within that broader adaptation strategy.
That is a fantastic commitment that I'm also signing, that we are, trying to do our part in working with other funders on this. And I have on my notes almost an ingredient list that I got from all of you of how to build a better ecosystem, how we can work better, from co-producing knowledge, from co-designing responses in the communities and in the districts, to breaking silos in government and in philanthropy, maybe between city governments and national governments, working on global exchange and cooperation and bringing in those partnerships into countries and going deep, investing in real relationship building. And all of these are not easy. It's we could spend hours in really going deep what that means. What I'm hearing from you is a commitment to trying to advance that work. And I want to open it up to the audience. Before I do that, I want to ask each one of you 1 minute. Just one minute answer, one idea. What's one opportunity, also from hearing yesterday and today, that you think coming out of this forum we should follow from the forum as an opportunity to be working on climate mobility also across sectors and doing together? What's one thing, if that's the only thing that you could do and push for? And I see the commissioner is ready to give us an idea. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hearing from all my fellow panelists, there is so much that we can do together. I think what I can really take from here is that we need a cross-sectoral approach to sorting out this climate change issue. We need a lot of cooperation, South-South and North-South cooperation. We know from the North a lot of technology development can be brought down to the South for us to benefit, but also vice versa. We have a lot of indigenous knowledge. Our young fella has brought this up. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge from all of us that we can also share and really develop useful technologies, useful interventions, and also work together to sorting out the climate change issues that we are facing today. Thank you.
Stephanie, do you want to go next?
Sure. Don't give up on the U.S. I think that civil society is still very much committed to this issue, and although kind of progress on climate and migration is not just stalled but really backsliding in the U.S., I think local communities who, again, are continuing to experience the impact of climate change within the U.S., I think are building capacity to welcome and building political will to welcome. And I think that coming out of this forum, the cities that I'm working with in the US are asking for sort of models of what works. And I think it's so clear we have so much to learn from communities in the global south. And then the second is that we can't wait for a more open government in the US to really start rebuilding support for contributing to the Loss and Damage Fund, for more robust immigration pathways to the US. And so I think we're committed to sort of continuing to fund the organizing ecosystem. And I think there is very special and untapped power in countries like the US to organize diaspora communities who are right now the very first, to respond when there's a big climate disaster in their home country and to raise funds. But I think we also want to channel that into political action to put pressure on donor governments as well.
Julia.
Thanks, Rafaela. At a time when the humanitarian reset conversation is very much focused on life-saving assistance, reactive responses, I'm really buoyed by the fact that this conversation has been about adaptation and a recognition that that's a long-term process that can include both mobility and the right to stay. I'm buoyed by the fact that the emphasis here has been on local and community leadership. And so concretely, if I was to think of two things that we could emphasise and work on, hearing Chiamaka and the importance of co-production of knowledge, I want to emphasise operationally a couple of things that can potentially be done. And one of them is community-led risk assessments so that communities can identify the hazards and risks that affect them, plan and prepare and identify and drive the solutions that they want to create for themselves by centering communities right at the outset in that risk assessment and enabling that co-production of knowledge right at the outset. We're setting ourselves on a good path to try and achieve those outcomes that we want to achieve. And I think another thing I want to kind of highlight also is early warning systems. There's a universe agenda to try and create universal early warning systems across the world. And I think even with community-based risk assessments, that type of system is essential. And again, you can centre communities, make sure we're speaking the right love language, as we learnt about yesterday, and ensuring that communities are able to receive and understand the messages they need to then drive their own solutions as well. So operationally, I think those two things are concretely something we can work on over the next 12, 18 months. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you.
For me, it will be the integration of climate mobility into adaptation plans, into urban planning strategies, into regional development frameworks, while simultaneously centering the perspectives, the priorities of those most affected. The focus should always be on co-production, co-designing with and not for the affected communities. And I think for us, one takeaway would be for us to reflect on how we can contribute to this fight, because I see it as a fight. And we can rely on our governments, but we can see globally that there is not a lot of political will. And so it falls on us. What can we do? And it's possible, it's easy to say I'm just one person, but one person with other people, then a network is forged and the coalition can be formed, and it's strong enough to pile pressure on our governments. And so I hope that from this conversation that we are having, we are energized to reflect on what we can do, and we commit to it, and yeah, the change we seek will come. Thank you.
Thank you. Agree with everything all panelists said, but just maybe to add, I think maybe there is an opportunity on the narrative aspect. I think, especially as they talk about building an ecosystem with a shared language, it was, I think, very well put by the Special Envoy earlier, how we can shift from an emergency narrative to more of a narrative of opportunities. I'm sure that everyone working in this field, and also GCCM colleagues working on research, is always a challenge between how we use the data and information to raise a much needed sense of urgency, but at the same time not fueling alarmistic narratives on mass migration in a shifting political context. And so how we can work together to equip political leaders at the local and national level with the right arguments, data, and evidence, but also supporting kind of a narrative that focuses more on opportunities. It's great to read positive adaptation journeys there. I think other elements like the diaspora contribution was mentioned earlier, and also how kind of migration and migrants can play a role in climate action, in green jobs, how climate investment can also be used positively to intervene at the origin, transit point, and destination, I think could be maybe an opportunity to reflect on as an ecosystem.
Well, that's a great agenda from the panel here to work on. I want to open it up to the floor. Andrea over here has the mic, and we can take 2 to 3 statements. So starting with Victoria over here, and then maybe we can move to the gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. My name is Victoria Rietig. I lead the Center for Migration at the German Council on Foreign Relations. We are a think tank here in Berlin. This was a fantastic panel. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the things that you said, and my question goes to Stephanie. You said a wonderful sentence, which was that the climate and migration sectors have totally different North Stars, and that part of what you're trying to do in your work is actually to bridge those divides between the climate justice sector and the kind of more traditional immigration justice sector. So can you give a few specific examples of the divides that you've encountered in your work and where you were actually successful in bridging them? And kind of the more concrete you can get there, the more appreciative I'd be. And of course, if others want to comment on this divide and how perhaps it has impacted your work, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll collect. So they're in the blue suit. Yes.
My name is Samuel. I'm working as a researcher at the German Center for Integration and Migration Study. And my question is to Madam Commissioner. And in my conversation with one of policymakers in Africa, and they say that, okay, Africa has been experiment space for policy-making process, like in terms of, for example, refugee convention, all these things. And you are saying now, mentioning about Kampala Convention, Kampala Ministerial Protocol, which is also linking, putting into fore the dignity of a migrant and considering adaptation, migration as adaptation strategy, and then also putting communities at the center of responses. And so how do African countries can reposition themselves in this polarized multilateral spaces in terms of taking agency now for bringing in, like considering migrant at the center, giving migrant agency rules, also considering local communities, putting them at the center of policy-making process. So how Africans are now with this Kampala Convention initiative, ministerial protocol, how can you put yourself in this leading roles in terms of multilateral arrangement?
Thank you so much. We'll take one more over here, and then two more. So please be brief. 2 more over there.
Okay. Thank you very much for for the panel. It was very interesting. The question I have, maybe any of you can answer is about partnerships. Oh, I'm Susan Eco, by the way. I work for the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. So the question is about partnerships. In practice, although partnerships are really important, it can be very challenging. Different actors come in with their mandates, with their priorities, but also there's limited funding. So could any of you give practical examples of how partnerships with different actors worked? When we're talking about disaster response, recovery, or any of the interventions related to climate mobility, how does it work in practice? Like a successful example of how different actors come together to do the interventions, also with the communities involved. Thanks.
Thank you. We can only take 2 more. We don't want to delay the other panels. So the gentleman over here, and then you in.
Yeah, thank you. George Scharfenberger from the University of California, Berkeley. I find myself apologizing a lot these days as an American. So first and foremost, I want to express my apologies to any of the people coming from the 36 countries who are now threatened once more with the visa restrictions. Many of countries represented here in this forum. This is not the best of America. Secondly, my own career has been in sustainable development for many decades. And I'd just like to complement what's already been said by 2 points. Number one can't underestimate the complexity that lies behind the phrase community-led development. Communities are not monolithic. They have incredibly complex power relationships, gender relationships, et cetera. So I think we need to be very careful, and I think this whatever's done here can learn from the experiences of the sustainable development community of what they've done right and also what they've done wrong. The second point is to say that, sorry, just lost my train of thought. As one looks forward in what's going on, there's another complexity, and that is deciding the allocation of scarce resources between what goes to staying and what goes to assisting those who leave. And at the end of the day, there's got to be some way that those decisions are made. Under what governance and what conditions. I think that's another something that is so complex that we need to begin to think about how we support our double objective of the right to stay and the right to move. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have you here in the front.
Yeah. Now, I think just on the intervention coming from, I just wanted to put my experience. Of course, building these forging coalitions and partnerships among various actors in the field is really important for this to happen. I, had the privilege to work with many UN organizations in one single project. Whole range of UN bodies were working in one single project. But to my surprise, I found that it was like many UN organizations jumping onto a very scarce resource. Yes, that I can understand because many funding cuts in different parts of the world, the resources getting constrained. But then, when these resources are to be mobilized and many organizations comes in, everyone trying to grab their pie, and end of the day, it's the community who suffers. So I think there needs to be, again, this is where that common understanding which I was talking about needs to come not only on providing the finance, but when it comes to the implementation as well, the common understanding, the common goal, the common objective has to be, between the various organizations. So I think that has to be something in mind that when we talk about coalition and forming, these. Just wanted to put
Thank
like
you.
that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I will turn it back to the panel, asking for very, very brief answers, and the invitation is also to approach all the panelists and exchange throughout the day, so we have more time and we don't overstep the coffee breaks, which are also vital to such a gathering. So Stephanie, there was a question to you about the different North Stars that the sectors have, and examples of also how they can be bridged and what can be done.
Yes, can give a few concrete examples, but definitely happy to speak more over lunch. And it's very basic to everybody in this room, I'm sure, but over the last year or so, we've really introduced that idea of the spectrum of climate mobility almost at the top of every conversation we have with climate people or migration people, as a way for people to see their kind of North Star reflected, but that even if your primary goal is to help people stay and build resilience and adaptation in place, we still need to prepare for people to move safely and for it to be sort of a choice and not kind of an emergency or an option of last resort. And so I think that through that spectrum, we've also just helped people, instead of it being really abstract, helping especially climate funders to see what we mean by these different kind of interventions. What does it look like to invest in resilience in place? What does it look like to invest in safe pathways? And helping people see themselves within it. And so, for example, there's a large climate adaptation funder in the US who does a lot of environment work. They also do a lot of work in American cities, and it was through seeing that kind of spectrum and understanding that mobility, the sort of hard infrastructures that cities will need to prepare for increased migration, as well as the sort of soft infrastructure of social cohesion, that they got it. And now they really see climate mobility as like a through line in their whole foundation. And on the sort of non-philanthropic side, I think sometimes it's easier, of course, with kind of justice movements for people to see themselves, but there's been a lot of work between sort of climate activists and immigration activists to see, again, along that spectrum. And so we're seeing joint advocacy calls in the same letter to members of Congress that call for safe migration pathways and to fund loss and damage, and saying it sort of in the same breath. So happy to give more examples, but I just think being extremely explicit has been helpful.
Thank you. Commissioner, there was a question to you and also asking for a very brief answer on the big question, how can African countries position themselves with agency in the times that we are in a multilateral context? Can you speak to that?
Thank you so much. And also for the question, how can African countries, I think, coordinate or put themselves forward when it comes to climate mobility agenda? I'll give an example of the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change. This declaration was signed or ratified in 2022. And with that, we are negotiating or also trying to bring on board the African countries so that it becomes the Kampala Declaration for the entire Africa. We used the African Climate Week in 2023 to really champion this, and we had a number of countries ratify to this declaration. And to us, I thought that was a very good platform. There are different platforms that we can use to really foster our agenda. So we use the Africa Climate Week. We also use the African Union. That is a very good platform where to sell some of these issues or things we really want to carry forward. There is also through the UN negotiation system, but that cuts across because it has to be accepted lower down first. So we are also talking to the least developed countries and the African group of negotiators. Whenever we get an opportunity, we bring this up. So those are some of the platforms we can use so that eventually it goes to the UNFCCC negotiation agenda. I think so. Thank you
so much. And then there was a question, and really maybe just name one example, one of you here on the panel, what is a really good practical implementation that we all can learn from? Maybe looking at Zandula or Giovanni.
Thanks, Rafaela. I also just wanted to quickly touch on Victoria's question, if you don't mind. I think part of it is actually also just about the narrative in terms of that divide. So when I look at it, the Red Cross operationally, there are a whole host of climate and disaster risk reduction actors operationally carrying out the work that enables the right to stay and enables the right to move with dignity. It's just that the language is not quite there, and we talked about this yesterday, of climate actors not necessarily speaking the language that migration and displacement actors understand, but the work itself is being done. So I think part of it is about storytelling and bridging that divide internally within organisations and these different actors about how the work that's being done by different sectors relate to this right to stay and relate to this right to go. And so for us, we've been trying to do that. We've just put out a report from Africa with 30 case studies, bringing our climate sector, our disaster risk reduction sector, our migration and displacement focal points, and identifying case studies where the work that's being done actually achieves those objectives. But maybe that's in itself a partnership. But one other kind of partnership, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that to the colleague who asked that question. In Asia Pacific, in other countries, our disaster law team has been working with governments and communities and other agencies to strengthen disaster risk governance. So bringing together and helping convene the relevant actors to understand the relevant risks and to incorporate those risks and longer term needs into governance frameworks so that that can then set the foundation for future work. But there's a lot more practical examples that I can talk about later. Thanks.
Thank you so much to a stellar panel for your ideas, your inputs. I really hope to continue the conversation, and please approach the panel.